Let me just give you a small example. Local parks in Britain have been fantastically renewed, transformed, turned around over the last while. It means that once again we're using parks, particularly in urban areas. It means that kids are in those parks. It means that wardens are back in those parks. Local authorities at the moment are cutting the funds of our parks. My local authority is cutting the funds by 50%. The government says, but communities can step in. Friends of parks can step in. They can cut the lawns and cut the grass and mow the trees. Now, actually, this is dangerous.
Getting slightly back to the topic here, before the party political broadcast goes too far.
It's dangerous because, in fact, we pool our resources to make sure that other people with expertise are able to do that. Most of us are far too busy to do that, and we run the risk that once again children will be ferrying through heroin needles and things because those parts were maintained, and that brings you right back to this risk assessment.
Great. Very quickly, Douglas.
This is a very good,
very quickly.
Very good example of that just there, that if you cut back public spending, children will be treading through heroin needles. I mean,
that's what happened in the 80s. You may not have been there, but that's what happened.
I was. I just don't. Maybe we have different memories of the decade.
Well, maybe you
look.
I mean, Chelsea, and I was in Brixton.
Quickly. Well, I wasn't brought up in Chelsea, but that's the typical Labour thing to do. Now, look, let's just do this. Let's just do this quickly. No Labour politician ever missed a round of applause by pretending that any opponent of theirs is against the welfare state. I never said I was against the welfare state. I simply object to the safety net, which was what the welfare state was meant to be, in Bevan's view. I object to the safety net becoming a safety blanket that cosets people throughout their lives and makes them morally and physically obese.
Okay, let's try the non-politician on the panel here. Dylan, you train people in the assessment of risk and thinking about risk and in judging risk, but clearly as individuals we can't all, I mean, I'm really not going to know if I'm going into an operation if the surgeon is going to have a row with his wife that morning and, you know, not pay attention. So when something goes wrong, if something goes wrong, shouldn't it be the state that assumes responsibility rather than the individual who has to judge all risks, and as David says, is not in a position to do so?
I think that certainly that should be ideally the case, but often the state gets it just as badly wrong as individuals. And so take, for example, the new security measures introduced at airports since 9/11. You know, since then, it seems that every new terrorist plot, whether it's successful or not, seems to add further checks to the gauntlet that passengers must run. So, you know, after the shoe bomber, Richard Reed, people had to take their shoes off. After British police foiled the attempt to detonate liquid explosives in 2006, passengers at UK airports weren't allowed to take liquids on board, and laptops were banned. Okay, you can take laptops on now, but there are still severe restrictions on liquids. The attempted bombing of Flight 253 on Christmas Day 2009, in which a passenger tried to set off explosives sewed into his underwear, led the US government to announce plans to spend $1 billion on full body scanners and other bomb detection devices. Now, I think all of these measures, they're security theatre. They're attempting to make us feel safer, but they're not actually making us safer.
But isn't that also because terrorism is theatre? After all, you could say more people die on the roads every year than died in 9/11, but the theatre of 9/11 was so powerful that there's a theatrical response.
Exactly, but that's precisely the aim of terrorists, is to provoke an overreaction.
So shouldn't the state then provide a matching theatre to reassure?
No, absolutely. Well, it might do, but let's think about the costs of that as well, because all of these measures have costs as well as benefits. So, I mean, the question is, what's the best way of spending our counter-terrorism budget or our counter-security or our security dollar? So take all those measures and since 9/11, in the 2 or 3 years following 9/11, all those extra measures led to much longer queues at airports, and in the US that attempt in turn had prompted many more people to drive rather than to fly, and since driving is much more dangerous, Garrick Blaylock, an American economist, estimated that from September 2001 to October 2003, these enhanced airport security measures led to 2,300 more road fatalities than would otherwise have occurred. I think that's a victory for Al-Qaeda.
David, you were involved, you were in government at the time when these things were much discussed. This question of possibility and probability, the question of reading the risk assessment every morning and being spooked by it, do you think that is an accurate assessment of how politicians respond? They have to be seen to do something, even if it's not very useful.
Well, in the end, at our best, politicians are, we're representatives. We live in a democracy and we must respond to our populations. But I think the indication from the other panellists is also that we must be prepared to lead. And sometimes leading against the clamour of noise, particular media noise, is extremely difficult. But I just want to inject another element to this, and that is that the critique of the state and of government in this area is very strong. The critique of big business and the consumer materialistic culture in which we live is not so strong, and must enter into this discussion, because part of what is going on, say, in the scenario that we've given, is also the relationship government has with the airline industries. Many of us have worried getting onto planes and sitting in these terrible tight spaces about blood clots, yet in the end they still cram us all together in planes in the way that they do. So, I mean, what I'm suggesting is that I think it's also important that we understand the other ingredient in the mix, and that is how government is able to stand up to big business, and how big business sometimes forces us down this road where they passing the burden to their consumers and their ordinary punters, and also where the poorer you are, the less able sometimes you are to navigate those risks. That's what we find certainly with the banking crisis in the end. It's that the poorer you are, the harder you pay the price. And that's why where we are at the moment is so pernicious, because basically poor people have to pay for the gambling and casino-like behaviour of some of the wealthiest in this country.
Douglas, I just want to ask you to respond. To be fair, you did. I don't think you heard it, but a point that was made earlier that it's not so much the nanny state that is generating this culture of absurd regulation and restriction on life, but that it's more the insurance industry. It's the atomization of society, and it's the insurance industry which is laying down ever more stringent conditions for any activity. Surely that's a problem of business rather than the state.
In part, sure. I mean, it propels it to an extent, but I think there's another reason that if I add into the mix, which I just can't help noticing, also drives government's interference in this. The driving behind the nanny state thing, and this is why the issue of the big society that David cited earlier was important, seems to me in part to be because so many other institutions that used to be present in people's lives are no longer there. And so government has to pick up the role of all sorts of other institutions, including community, including church or congregation or religion, and all sorts of other things. So as it were, as everything else starts to move out of the public sphere, the public square, the only thing left to decide and to guide, badly, as I said earlier, is government.
But government guides, but to what extent do we think that politicians find social fear useful, find the fear amongst the voters a useful instrument in politics?
I think this is way overblown, this idea that, that this is kind of the idea evoked by, say, this BBC documentary a few years ago, The Power of Nightmares, in which, there's a bunch of really Machiavellian politicians who sort of think that they can terrorise the population and sort of advance covertly their sort of dark political objectives. But I think the politicians are just as scared, often more scared, as Douglas was saying, than us. It's not that they're sort of using fear they are as irrational as us and are prone to just as much. So they're not pushing fear as sort of in some cynical way, they're just sincerely scared.
You would apply that to the case for war in Iraq and the dodgy dossier?
Yes, I would. I think I don't think there's any evidence to show that there was any deliberate deception going on there. I think they were really as fooled by, I think they were genuinely scared that Iraq had WMD. I think that So, for example, to take that, I think the spies knew that there were lots of caveats, and there are interesting reasons why those caveats didn't make it through to the briefings that Powell got, for example. But I think the people at the top there were scared, perhaps paranoid, but they, sincerely paranoid.
I'm so glad to hear somebody else criticising the Adam Curtis work of fantasy, The Power of Nightmares. Truly one of the worst pieces of journalism in recent years, which claimed that there was effectively no terrorist threat, that it had been invented by Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz. And then, of course, shortly after the documentary came out and won such a claim, the bombs went off on the London Underground, and Adam Curtis didn't look quite so smart. But just quickly on this, I mean, the issue for politicians is obvious, is that, of course, they don't just have to look after themselves. They know that it'll come back on them if they aren't seen to have looked after other people. And so those people who sort of don't like the extra stringent measures at airport security that are put in place and who are particularly questioning of them, obviously you can question them, but I have to say the motivation behind them, I think one can understand. You wouldn't want to be the politician that gave in to some of the pressure groups last year who were asking for less stringent airport checks. And they were doing so only a week before then the cartridge plot for Manwa Awlaki in the Yemen was found. You wouldn't want to be the politician who said, let's lay off some of those checks, and then had to answer the newspapers and the public a week later when you had downed planes.
I think two things occur to me. One, I think that as a society, for the last, 30 years or so, we are far better in all political parties at talking about the individual at one end, or about big ideas and the collective at the other. In between that, when it comes to family, when it comes to neighbourhood, when it comes to community, politics is very, very poor. And indeed, actually, when we do start to talk about that, we tend to turn community into localism and foundation hospitals and people sitting on boards. It doesn't really relate to how people live their lives. And I think that is a big element of the ability to sort of get down to where does risk really lie. But then I also think there are just modern phenomenons and modern demands that we respond to. I heard Esther Ranson on the radio a few months back, and she was talking about Childline and that whole push to protect children. And she said at one point, if one child is saved, it's worth it. And I thought, but hang on a minute. If that meant the school or the Sunday school cancelled a minibus trip for 60 children, is that really worth it? Should we really be asking parents running a Sunday school to do CRB checks? How many men in this audience would feel comfortable walking down the road with two 8-year-old boys holding their hands who were not their own? I suspect actually very few of us. That's the culture in which we live. That's the mix into which the politician has to come. That's where the leadership is required, and that's where both industry and media force the politician into this place where you want to pretend that you can shut out all risk entirely.
But Dylan, surely that's a question of balance. They've created more fear around an exercise in reassurance.
That's true, but I think what David is saying is very important about the incentive, and what Douglas was saying also about the incentives that politicians have faced. In a sense, they are largely maybe guilty of just following, but you can understand why from an election point of view. But the point, I think it points to the deeper problem, is that this is a collective failure. It's not just the politicians over-regulating, it's the fact that we're all really bad at assessing risk. We're very uncomfortable with uncertainties. We tend to prefer the securities of black or white thinking. We have a need for closure, and then that's why we vote in politicians who say, yes, it's this way or it's that way, and instead of, and so we get the politicians we deserve.
Yeah.
So, how much fear do you think? How much risk? And clearly, Douglas, you think that we should all accept our own risk, and that I think you were arguing that it's not really the state's business to make us feel safer, but we should take risk on board personally. So is fear and risk an essential part of life, and we should simply learn to deal with it ourselves?
Well, yes, but we can deal with parts of it ourselves. of course, we can't deal with the totality of it. I mean, the problem for government is that it's not risk for itself; it's accepting risk on behalf of others. I personally, I much prefer I prefer a situation in this country where people were more